What if your job involved healing Pikachu, bandaging Charmander, and saving the day for Pokemon trainers across the region? Sounds like a dream for any Pokemon fan, right? But here's the thing, being a Pokemon nurse isn't just about cuddling cute Pokemon. It's a high-stakes job where every decision could mean the difference between life and fainting. So, how much does a Pokemon nurse like Nurse Joy actually make? And is it worth the chaos of dealing with hyper beams and overzealous trainers? Let's break it down. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how much a Pokemon nurse earns, how it compares to real-world healthcare jobs, and whether the paycheck is enough to live on in a world full of Thunderbolts and Flamethrowers. Plus, we'll dive into the daily grind, the perks, and the challenges of being the go-to healer for Pokemon everywhere. Stick around because we're breaking it all down, from salaries and bonuses to what it's really like to run a Pokemon center. First, let's talk about what it means to be a Pokemon nurse. In the real world, a nurse is a healthcare professional who cares for patients, administers treatments, and supports doctors. They typically need a nursing degree and a license to practice. But in the Pokemon universe, being a Pokemon nurse is a whole different ballgame. You're not just caring for humans, you're healing Pokemon, from tiny Caterpie to massive Dragonite. Your day-to-day involves everything from diagnosing status conditions like poison and burn to operating high-tech healing machines. Oh, and don't forget the occasional awkward moment when a trainer brings in a fainted Magikarp and expects you to work miracles. So, what does a typical day look like for a Pokemon nurse? Your morning starts with a quick check of the Pokemon Center's healing machines, because, of course, you need to make sure they're ready to handle everything from a scratched Pidgey to a Charizard that's been hit by a hydro pump. Once everything's up and running, you open the doors and wait for the trainers to arrive. By midday, you're juggling multiple patients, maybe a Bulbasaur with a nasty case of poison, a Squirtle that's been frozen solid, and a trainer who's panicking because their Eevee won't stop crying. And let's not forget the occasional rush when a gym leader brings in their entire team after a tough battle. For example, imagine you're working at the Pokemon Center in Cerulean City and Misty shows up with her Starmie, which has been knocked out by a Thunderbolt. What do? Do you prioritize Starmie over the other patients, or do you stick to your triage system? These are the kinds of dilemmas you'd face every day as a Pokemon nurse. Speaking of dilemmas, let's talk about a nightmare scenario. What if a trainer brings in a legendary Pokemon like Mewtwo and it's critically injured? As a Pokemon nurse, it's your job to stay calm under pressure, even when the stakes are sky high. You'd need to coordinate with other nurses, consult your Pokédex for rare conditions, and maybe even call in Professor Oak for backup. And let's not forget the pressure of knowing that if you fail, you could lose the trust of trainers and maybe even the Pokemon League. So, how does this compare to real-world healthcare jobs? In the real world, a registered nurse earns an average of $75,000 to $100,000 a year, depending on experience and location. But as a Pokemon nurse, you're not just dealing with humans, you're caring for creatures that can shoot fire, electricity, and even psychic energy. That's a whole new level of responsibility. And let's not forget about bonuses. In the real world, nurses often earn extra pay for overtime, specialized skills, or working in high-demand areas. In the Pokemon world, you might get a bonus for handling rare Pokemon, working during a major tournament, or saving a critically injured Pokemon. These bonuses could range from $10,000 to $50,000 Poké-dollars a year, depending on your performance. But let's be real, no bonus is going to make up for the stress of dealing with a Hyper Beam mishap. So, how much would a Pokemon nurse make? Let's do the math. If we assume the average Pokemon nurse handles about 50 patients a day and charges 500 Poké-dollars per treatment, that's 25,000 Poké-dollars a day. Over a year, that adds up to around 9 million Poké-dollars in revenue. Now, as a Pokemon nurse, you're not pocketing the full amount. Let's say you take a 10% profit margin after accounting for equipment, supplies, and Pokemon Center overhead. That means your annual earnings would come out to around 900,000 Poké-dollars a year. That's right, enough to afford a comfortable lifestyle in a world full of adventure and danger, but probably not enough to buy your own private island in the Orange Archipelago. But could you live on that salary? If you're working in a bustling city like Saffron or Goldenrod, 900,000 Poké-dollars a year would be more than enough to cover basic expenses like food, housing, and the occasional upgrade to your healing machines. But if you're stationed in a small town like Pallet, you might struggle to make ends meet, especially when you factor in the cost of rare healing items like full restores and revives. Is it a livable wage? Absolutely. But hey, at least you get free room and board at the Pokemon Center, as long as you don't mind sharing the break room with Chansey. And of course, the perks might just make up for it. Imagine having access to cutting-edge healing technology, working with Pokemon from all over the region, and being the go-to healer for some of the most skilled trainers in the world. Plus, let's not forget the bragging rights. How many people can say they've healed a legendary Pokemon? There can be challenges. You'd be dealing with constant chaos, the pressure to save lives, and the occasional existential crisis when you realize you're responsible for the health of creatures that can level cities. And let's not forget the risk of getting caught in the crossfire of a Pokemon battle. So, would you take the job as a Pokemon nurse, or would you demand a raise to deal with the constant chaos and high stakes healing? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more wild breakdowns, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next adventure.